If you cannot accept the truth of my weekends, then maybe you should not be part of my life at all. Those were the exact words my husband Mark Bennett said to me on a Tuesday night in our kitchen, as if he were discussing something as ordinary as changing a cable subscription rather than dismantling our entire marriage in under 10 seconds. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming behind him, the soft ticking of the clock above the stove, and the way he did not even look up from his phone when he said it. I stood there holding a ceramic mug that had gone cold long before I realized I was no longer part of the conversation but part of the problem. "Say that again," I asked quietly, thinking I must have misunderstood him. Mark finally looked at me, not with anger, not with guilt, but with a kind of calm certainty that made my stomach tighten. "Jessica understands me," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Jessica Reed. His ex-wife. The name had been floating around our marriage for months like a shadow neither of us fully acknowledged but both of us could feel in every room. Weekends away that became routine. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Sudden laughter at messages he would not show me. And now this. A sentence that did not even pretend to care about how it sounded. I placed the mug down slowly on the counter because my hands had started to shake in a way I did not want him to notice. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, keeping my voice steady even though something inside me was cracking. "You are telling me that if I cannot accept you spending weekends with your ex-wife, I should leave." Mark sighed like I was exhausting him. "It is not like that," he said. "It is just weekends. She is going through things. We understand each other in a way you and I do not anymore." That was the moment something shifted in the air between us. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal realization that I was no longer being asked to share my husband. I was being asked to accept losing him politely. I turned away slightly, looking out the kitchen window where the streetlights were beginning to glow against the darkening sky. Our suburban neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Perfect lawns, quiet houses, nothing that suggested a marriage was currently being rewritten inside one of them. And what am I supposed to be in this arrangement? I asked finally. Mark did not answer immediately. That silence told me more than anything he could have said. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost indifferent. "You are my wife, Laura. That does not change." But it had already changed. I could feel it in the space between his words. I could feel it in the way he no longer included me in decisions that used to be ours. I could feel it in the way Jessica's presence had become something he protected more carefully than he protected me. That night I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply stood there longer than I should have while he returned to his phone as if nothing important had just happened. But as I lay awake later listening to him move around the house like a man living two separate lives, I realized something I had been avoiding for months. This was not about weekends. This was about replacement. And I was still standing in the middle of it, waiting for someone to tell me when I had officially stopped being part of my own marriage. The next morning felt unchanged on the surface, but everything inside me had already shifted into something I could not reverse. I woke up before Mark, staring at the ceiling of our bedroom while listening to the familiar sounds of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. The faint noise of him moving around downstairs. The coffee machine starting automatically at 6:30. The distant sound of his phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. All of it used to feel like comfort. Now it felt like evidence of distance. When I finally went downstairs, Mark was already dressed, standing at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when I entered the room. "Good morning," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "Morning," he replied without emotion. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table instead of standing beside him like I usually did. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was structured, intentional, as if there were rules neither of us had spoken out loud. After a moment I asked, "Are you seeing Jessica this weekend?" Mark finally looked up, slightly annoyed by the question. "Yes," he said simply. That one word confirmed what I had already begun to understand the night before. There was no hesitation anymore. No attempt to soften it. It was now part of his routine, as normal as going to work or paying bills. "For how long?" I asked. "All weekend," he replied, returning to his phone immediately after. I nodded slowly, even though he was not watching me anymore. Something inside me tightened. Not with anger yet, but with clarity forming beneath the surface. Do you ever think about how this looks? I asked quietly. Mark sighed again, louder this time. Laura, we already talked about this. You are making it more complicated than it needs to be. There it was again. That phrase. Complicated. As if my feelings were the problem. As if the situation only became difficult when I noticed it. I watched him for a moment longer, trying to recognize the man I had built a life with. The man who once planned vacations with me, who once asked my opinion before making decisions, who once made me feel like I was part of something stable. That man felt further away now than Jessica ever did. Over the next few days, the pattern became undeniable. Friday evenings he left earlier and earlier. Saturday mornings he was gone before I woke up. Sunday nights he returned quieter, more distant, as if he had to readjust to being in our house again. Each time he came back, he carried a version of himself that felt slightly different from the one who left. More relaxed, more detached, more unavailable. I started noticing details I had ignored before. The way he placed his phone face down whenever I entered a room. The way he stepped outside to take calls that lasted longer than necessary. The way he stopped including me in simple decisions like dinner plans or weekend errands. One evening I stood in the hallway watching him pack a small overnight bag. He moved efficiently without explanation. You are leaving early again, I said. Traffic, he replied without looking at me. I hesitated before speaking again. Is she waiting for you? That made him pause just long enough for me to know I had hit something real. He closed the bag and finally turned toward me. This is exactly what I meant, he said firmly. You interrogate everything. Jessica does not do that. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were loud, but because they were simple. Direct comparison. No hesitation. No protection of my feelings. I stood still as he picked up his bag and walked past me toward the door. Before leaving, he added, Try to relax this weekend, Laura. Not everything is a problem. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in the hallway with a silence that felt different from before. This one was not passive. It was defining. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house became completely still, replaying every moment I had dismissed as minor. Every weekend explanation. Every comparison disguised as harmless comment. Every moment I was told I was overthinking. And slowly, something uncomfortable but undeniable began to form in my mind. I was not part of a misunderstanding. I was part of a replacement process I had been watching without fully seeing. And the most disturbing realization was not that he was choosing her. It was that he had already stopped asking whether I would accept it. By the third week, I stopped counting how many times Mark left the house without explaining where he was going. At first, I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, telling myself that couples go through difficult phases, that maybe I was overreacting, that Jessica Reed was just a temporary distraction rather than a permanent shift in our marriage. But denial only works when the other person is not consistently reinforcing the truth in front of you. One Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual and realized the bed beside me was already empty. The impression of his presence had barely faded from the sheets, which meant he had left before dawn again. I walked downstairs quietly and found a small note on the counter. It simply said he would be back late Sunday. No explanation. No apology. No acknowledgement of the growing silence between us. I stood there reading it longer than necessary, as if repetition might reveal a different meaning. That afternoon, I decided to go for a drive. I told myself it was just to clear my head, but somewhere deep down I already knew I was searching for something I did not want to confirm. I drove past places Mark and I used to visit together. The diner where we had our anniversary breakfast. The park where we used to walk on Sunday afternoons. Everything looked unchanged, which somehow made my internal shift feel even more isolating. Eventually, I found myself turning down a street I had only heard mentioned once in passing during one of Mark's calls. A quiet residential area lined with larger homes and carefully maintained gardens. I did not have a clear plan. I only knew I needed to understand what his weekends actually looked like. I parked a few houses away and waited. First, nothing happened. Just the quiet rhythm of suburban life. Then, after about 20 minutes, I saw his car. I recognized it immediately. It pulled into the driveway of a house I had never seen before. My chest tightened, but I stayed still. A few moments later, Jessica Reed appeared at the front door. She was smiling before he even fully stepped out of the car. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else. Not the fact that she was there, but the ease of it. The familiarity. The way he moved toward her like this was not an interruption in my marriage but a continuation of something I had simply not been invited to witness. I did not approach them. I did not confront them. I simply sat in my car and watched the scene unfold from a distance that suddenly felt like the real distance between all three of us. They spoke briefly at the doorway, then disappeared inside together without hesitation. No tension. No secrecy. Just routine. I do not know how long I stayed there afterward. Long enough for the light to shift slightly. Long enough for my breathing to slow down into something controlled again. On the drive home I did not cry. I did not feel anger yet either. What I felt instead was a kind of quiet clarity forming in layers, like something inside me had stopped trying to negotiate with a situation that no longer required my participation. That evening, when Mark returned, I watched him more carefully than before. He came in around 10:30, setting his keys on the counter as if everything about his day had been ordinary. "You are still up," he said casually. "Yes," I replied. He paused slightly, as if expecting a question I was no longer going to ask. "How was your weekend?" I finally said. He smiled faintly. "Good. Productive." That was all he offered. No detail. No mention of where he had been. No acknowledgement that I might already know. I nodded slowly, accepting the answer without reaction. For the first time, I understood that asking him for truth was no longer the point. He had already decided which version of reality I was allowed to hear. And I realized something even more important in that moment. If I kept waiting for honesty from him, I would never move forward. Because the story he was living in no longer included me as a participant, only as an obstacle to be managed. By the time the following week arrived, I had stopped expecting things to change on their own. Instead, I began observing patterns with a level of attention that felt almost unfamiliar to me, as if I was finally stepping outside of my own marriage and viewing it from a distance. Mark's behavior had become predictable in its unpredictability. He left without explanation, returned without detail, and spoke about his weekends as if they were private territory that required no clarification. Jessica Reed had become a name that existed more in physical reality than in conversation, yet her presence shaped every silence in our home. One evening, while I was folding laundry in the living room, I noticed Mark's phone lighting up repeatedly on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower, and the screen flashed with a message preview that I could not ignore even if I had tried. I did not pick up the phone, but I did walk closer. The notifications were brief but enough to confirm a pattern. Coordinated timing, frequent communication, and a level of familiarity that went beyond casual contact. I stepped away before he returned, telling myself again that I was gathering understanding, not suspicion. Later that night, Mark sat across from me at dinner as if nothing had changed between us. He asked about my day with polite detachment, and I answered with equal calm. The conversation felt like two people carefully avoiding the same subject in different ways. After dinner, I finally asked a question that had been building for weeks. "Do you think this arrangement is fair?" Mark looked up slowly, clearly not expecting directness. "What arrangement?" he asked. I did not react to the avoidance. "You, Jessica, and me," I said. He exhaled lightly, almost amused. "Laura, this is not some kind of arrangement. It is just life. People change. Relationships evolve." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else he had said. It was designed to sound reasonable, but it did not explain anything. It simply redefined the situation in a way that required my acceptance rather than mutual understanding. And where do I fit in that evolution? I asked quietly. Mark leaned back in his chair, as if the question itself was inconvenient. "You are still my wife," he said. "Nothing changes that." But his tone suggested the opposite. Not in words but in structure, in priority, in attention, in presence. The following weekend, I made a decision I had been avoiding. I told him I was going to visit a friend out of town. It was not true, but it was the first time I had created space instead of waiting for it to be given. Mark barely reacted. He simply nodded and said, "Drive safely," without asking for details. That indifference confirmed more than any argument could have. Instead of leaving town, I stayed nearby and followed a direction I had memorized from previous observations. I parked at a distance again, careful not to be noticed, and waited. When Mark arrived at Jessica Reed's house, there was no hesitation in his movements. No secrecy. No caution. He walked up the path as if it belonged to him as much as his own home. Jessica met him at the door almost immediately, and the ease between them was no longer subtle. It was established, comfortable, normal in a way that excluded everything I had been told to accept as my place. I did not approach. I did not interrupt. I simply watched, and for the first time I stopped trying to interpret the situation in a way that made it less severe. There was nothing unclear anymore. The truth was not hidden. It was simply divided. That night, I returned home before him and sat in the dark living room for a long time without turning on any lights. I thought about every explanation I had accepted, every moment I had been asked to be patient, and every time I had been told I was overthinking. And slowly, something settled inside me that felt different from sadness or anger. It felt like decision forming quietly beneath exhaustion. When Mark finally returned hours later, I did not ask where he had been. I did not need to. I was no longer waiting for truth from him, because I had already started preparing for a version of my life where truth would no longer depend on his permission. By the time the next month began, my life had settled into a quiet pattern that no longer included asking questions I already knew would not be answered honestly. Mark continued his weekends with Jessica Reed without hesitation, and I stopped pretending that silence between us was temporary. Instead, it became structural, like the foundation of a house that had already shifted beyond repair. One morning, while reviewing our shared household finances, I noticed something I had previously ignored because I had trusted him to manage everything. A series of transactions that did not match our usual spending patterns appeared in our joint account. Small withdrawals at first, then larger ones spaced consistently around his weekends away. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the numbers longer than I intended, not because I did not understand them, but because I finally did. That evening, when Mark returned home, I asked him calmly about a specific charge. He barely looked at the statement. "It is probably just travel expenses," he said without concern. "Jessica and I split costs when we go out." The way he said her name without hesitation confirmed how natural this entire situation had become for him. I did not argue. I simply closed the folder and placed it back on the counter. Something inside me had stopped reacting emotionally and started processing practically. Over the following days, I began quietly organizing every financial record I could access. Bank statements, credit activity, shared subscriptions, and anything tied to accounts we both used. I did not confront him again because confrontation required belief in a shared reality, and I was no longer certain we had one. One afternoon, while Mark was out, I received a call from a mutual acquaintance who had seen him with Jessica at a local restaurant during what he had described to me as a work commitment weekend. The tone of the conversation was cautious, almost apologetic, as if confirming what I already knew felt inappropriate. I thanked them politely and hung up, feeling no shock, only confirmation. That night, when Mark came home later than usual, I noticed something different in his demeanor. He seemed more relaxed than before, almost relieved, as if distance from me had become easier to maintain than presence. "You are quiet lately," he said while removing his jacket. "Just thinking," I replied. He nodded as if that explanation was sufficient. "Try not to overthink things," he added casually. That phrase, once familiar, now felt like a barrier placed between us rather than advice. After he went to sleep, I sat alone in the living room and spread everything I had collected across the table. It was no longer just suspicion or emotional interpretation. It was structure, patterns, evidence of a life divided into two parallel realities where I existed only in one of them. I realized then that the most painful part was not betrayal itself but normalization. He had not hidden it carefully. He had simply expected me to adjust until it felt less significant. Over time, I stopped trying to understand Jessica Reed as a rival and began understanding her as part of a system he had built. A system where emotional accountability was optional, and honesty was conditional. By the end of that week, I made a decision that did not come from anger but from clarity. I opened a separate account in my own name and began moving small portions of money quietly, carefully, without Disruption. Not as retaliation but as preparation. Because I finally understood that nothing about this situation was going to resolve itself through conversation. And if Mark had already decided what his life looked like without asking me, then I would need to decide mine the same way. By the time the following weekend arrived, the distance between Mark and me had become something that no longer needed to be spoken about. It was simply present in every room, every silence, and every routine interaction that used to feel natural. He no longer asked about my plans and I no longer asked about his. The house functioned like two separate schedules passing through the same space without intersecting. That Friday evening, Mark left earlier than usual, carrying a small overnight bag without explanation. I watched him from the kitchen as he checked his phone once before stepping out, his expression already mentally elsewhere. He did not say goodbye in any meaningful way. Just a casual, "I will be back Sunday," as if it were a calendar reminder rather than a personal departure. After the door closed, I stood still for a moment longer than necessary. The silence he left behind was no longer painful. It was usable. That was the only way I could describe it. Over the past weeks, I had slowly shifted from reaction to observation, and from observation to planning. The separate account I had opened was no longer symbolic. It had become active. I transferred small amounts at first, carefully aligned with shared expenses so nothing would draw attention. It was not revenge. It was structure correction. A way of restoring balance in a system that had already been quietly rearranged without my consent. On Saturday morning, I drove past the familiar route again. I told myself it was not about confirmation anymore, but about understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. When I reached the street where Jessica Reed lived, I parked farther away than before. I no longer needed to see everything up close. Distance gave clarity instead of confusion. Mark's car was already there. That detail no longer surprised me. What surprised me instead was my lack of emotional reaction to. There was no shock, no anger spike, no internal collapse. Only recognition. A pattern continuing exactly as expected. I did not approach the house. I did not interrupt anything. I simply observed from a distance long enough to understand that nothing about this arrangement was temporary. It had stabilized. Later that afternoon, I returned home and began reviewing everything again, not for emotional validation, but for final confirmation. The financial patterns, the timing of withdrawals, the overlap between his claimed work commitments and his actual locations. It all formed a structure that was no longer ambiguous. That evening, Mark returned later than expected. He seemed lighter than usual, almost satisfied in a way he had not been at home for months. "You look tired," he said briefly as he walked past me. "I am fine," I replied. He nodded and continued moving through the house as if re-entering a space he only partially belonged to. "Jessica had a good weekend," he added casually while placing his keys on the counter. The way he said it without hesitation confirmed something I had already accepted internally. He was no longer balancing two versions of his life. He had chosen one and expected the other to adjust quietly. I looked at him for a moment without responding. Not out of shock but out of final assessment. "That is good," I said calmly. He paused slightly, as if expecting resistance that never came. "You are handling this better," he said, almost approvingly. That statement revealed more than he realized. In his mind, my silence was progress, not decision. My lack of reaction was acceptance, not preparation. After he went to sleep that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table once again. But this time there was no confusion left to process. The documents were organized. The financial separation was underway. The emotional distance was complete. What remained was execution. And for the first time since this began, I was no longer asking myself what he was doing on his weekends. I was asking myself what I would do when I stopped letting them define my life entirely. By the following week, the silence in the house had transformed into something more structured than distance. It had become routine. Mark continued leaving every Friday with the same overnight bag, the same minimal explanation, and the same expectation that I would not question it. And I no longer did. Not because I understood him, but because I had stopped measuring my life against his behavior. Instead, I was measuring outcomes. The financial separation I had begun was now stable enough that I could see the outline of independence forming clearly. Not dramatic, not sudden, but consistent. Quiet transfers aligned with shared expenses had gradually created a buffer that gave me space to think without pressure. That alone changed how I moved through the house. I no longer felt trapped by immediacy. One Thursday evening, I received a message from a bank alert confirming a larger withdrawal from our joint account. It matched Mark's usual weekend timing pattern, but this time the amount was significantly higher. I stared at the notification longer than I needed to, not from surprise, but from confirmation that the system I had been mapping was continuing exactly as expected. When Mark returned home later that night, I did not confront him immediately. Instead, I waited until he had settled into his usual post-weekend rhythm, when his attention was divided and his guard was low. He entered the kitchen, placed his keys down, and glanced at me briefly. "You are quiet again," he said casually. "Just thinking," I replied. He nodded as if that was acceptable and poured himself a glass of water. "Jessica had a busy weekend," he added after a moment, as if updating me on neutral information rather than a parallel life. I watched him carefully, noting not what he said, but how naturally he said it. There was no hesitation anymore. No awareness that disclosure required consideration. That alone told me more than any document. "Did you go anywhere else?" I asked calmly. He paused slightly, just long enough to register that I was asking differently than before. "No," he said simply. That answer was not new, but my perception of it was. I no longer evaluated it for truthfulness. I evaluated it for structure. After dinner, I sat at the table reviewing everything. Again, not because I was uncertain, but because I was preparing for precision. Every financial record, every weekend absence, every inconsistency in his explanations had formed a timeline that no longer required interpretation. It only required execution. Later that night, I overheard him on a phone call outside on the back patio. His voice was lower than usual, relaxed, almost content. I did not try to listen closely, but certain phrases carried through the glass door. Weekend plans, travel adjustments, timing coordination. Nothing urgent, nothing secretive in his tone. It was simply the language of someone managing a life that was already fully integrated elsewhere. When he came back inside, he did not notice that I had heard anything. Or perhaps he assumed I no longer cared enough to connect details. That assumption was becoming one of the most important elements of this entire situation. The next morning, I made a decision that shifted everything internally, even if nothing changed externally yet. I scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor under my own name. I began compiling a complete record of assets, obligations, and shared liabilities without relying on anything he controlled or explained. It was not emotional. It was procedural. And in that procedure, I finally understood something important. I was no longer reacting to a marriage. I was exiting a structure that had already been operating without my consent for a long time. That evening, when Mark mentioned another weekend away, I simply nodded without asking follow-up questions. He smiled slightly, mistaking my silence for acceptance again. But for me, silence had changed meaning completely. It was no longer surrender. It was preparation finishing its final stage before action. By the following weekend, I no longer measured my life in terms of Mark Bennett's comings and goings. I measured it in terms of what I was building independently of him. The financial separation process had moved from quiet preparation into structured execution. Accounts that had once been shared were now clearly divided, not through confrontation, but through consistent, careful steps that left no emotional residue behind. I did not announce anything to Mark. There was no need. He had already built a life where my awareness was optional, so I began building one where his permission was no longer required. That Friday evening, he repeated his usual pattern. He packed his overnight bag, checked his phone, and gave me a brief update that he would return on Sunday. I responded with a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. He seemed satisfied with that level of interaction, mistaking it again for acceptance rather than transition. After he left, I sat in the quiet house and reviewed the latest financial summary from my independent account. The numbers were no longer abstract. They represented autonomy, stability, a structure that did not depend on his explanations or inconsistencies. The following morning, I drove past the familiar route once more, not out of emotional compulsion, but as a final verification. I stopped at a distance from Jessica Reed's house and observed without urgency. Mark's car was there again. This time, I did not feel the internal disruption I had once associated with seeing it. There was only confirmation that the pattern continued exactly as expected. What surprised me most was not the situation itself, but how little it affected me now. The emotional charge had been replaced by clarity so complete that it no longer required interpretation. That afternoon, I attended a scheduled meeting with a financial advisor. I brought every document I had collected, every statement, every record of shared obligations. The process was methodical, almost clinical. As I reviewed everything aloud, I realized how much of my previous life had depended on verbal trust rather than verified structure. At one point, the advisor asked a simple question about joint liabilities, and I answered without hesitation. For the first time, I was not describing confusion. I was describing facts. That distinction mattered more than anything else. When I returned home that evening, Mark was already there, unusually early. He looked relaxed, as if the weekend had already begun in his mind. "You are home early," he said casually. "Finished my day," I replied. He nodded and turned back to his phone. "Jessica is planning something for next weekend," he said after a moment, almost conversationally. I paused briefly, observing him without emotional reaction. "That sounds good," I said simply. He smiled faintly, satisfied with my lack of resistance. What he did not realize was that my silence no longer represented endurance. It represented completion of preparation. Later that night, while he slept, I finalized the last of the financial arrangements. Everything that needed to be separated had been identified. Everything that required independence had been secured. I sat in the dark living room afterward, no longer feeling tension or anticipation. Only clarity remained. For months, I had been positioned as someone reacting to a situation I did not control. But that perception had already ended. I was no longer inside the structure of his choices. I was standing outside of it, looking at it as something that no longer defined my direction. And for the first time since this began, I understood that the next step would not be about understanding him at all. It would be about finalizing a life that no longer included him as a variable. By the time the final weekend of the month arrived, I no longer felt like I was waiting for anything to change. The process that had begun as confusion had already matured into structure, and that structure now had a direction. Everything I needed to separate had been separated. Every account that required independence had been secured. Every document that defined shared responsibility had been reviewed, copied, and placed into its correct legal pathway. There was no emotional urgency left in it. Only completion. That Friday morning, Mark followed his usual routine without noticing anything different. He packed his overnight bag, checked his phone, and moved through the house with the same quiet confidence he always had when leaving for weekends with Jessica Reed. "I will be back Sunday evening," he said casually, as he always did. "Okay," I replied. My tone was steady, neutral, uninviting of further discussion. He paused for half a second, as if sensing nothing unusual, then left the house without hesitation. The door closing behind him did not create the same emotional echo it once had. Instead, it marked something closer to final timing. I waited exactly 1 hour before beginning the last step. I placed the completed documents on the kitchen table, neatly organized, each page aligned with deliberate precision. There were no dramatic gestures, no scattered papers, no emotional disorder. Everything was structured because I no longer needed chaos to validate clarity. When Mark returned that Sunday evening, it was earlier than expected. I heard his keys before I saw him. The door opened, and he stepped inside with the same relaxed expression he always carried after weekends away. But something in the atmosphere must have registered differently for him immediately, because he stopped when he saw me sitting at the table. The documents were in front of me. "You are home early," he said instinctively. "So are you," I replied calmly. He looked at the papers but did not fully process them at first. Not until he stepped closer. Not until he recognized what they represented. His expression shifted slightly as understanding formed. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was already visible. I did not rush my response. "It is the result of everything you told me over the past months," I said evenly. He frowned, scanning the pages more carefully now. The silence between us was no longer the same kind we had lived with before. This one had definition. "Laura, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice lower now, less casual. I met his eyes without hesitation. "I am finishing what you started when you decided I was no longer part of your weekends, your choices, or your priorities," I said. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to reset the situation back into something familiar. "This is unnecessary. You are overreacting." That phrase, once powerful in its ability to destabilize me, now carried no weight at all. I simply observed him. "No," I said quietly. "I am finally reacting correctly." He stepped closer to the table, reading further, realizing the financial separation was already complete, the arrangements already finalized, the structure already moved beyond negotiation. For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression that I had not seen before. Not anger, not dismissal, but loss of control. "You did all of this without telling me," he said. "You did all of this without including me," I replied. That distinction settled heavily between us. He sat down slowly, as if the physical act of sitting could slow down what was happening. "We can fix this," he said after a moment. "You are misunderstanding everything." I shook my head gently. "I understood everything clearly weeks ago," I said. "That is why this exists." The house was completely quiet except for his breathing. No distractions, no interruptions, no external noise to soften the moment. Only the final shape of truth. After a long pause, I stood up and collected my personal belongings that had already been packed earlier. There was nothing rushed about it. No anger guiding my movements. Only completion. At the doorway, I stopped briefly. Mark was still sitting at the table, looking at the papers as if they might change if he read them again. "Where are you going?" he asked quietly. I looked back once. Not with sadness, not with anger, only with final clarity. "To a life where I am not waiting to be chosen," I said. And then I left. The door closed behind me without hesitation, without resistance, and without the expectation that I would return. For the first time in a long time, silence did not feel like absence. It felt like ownership.